hears me like clearly, right? So, hello, my name is Yunjia, and I am a MA student at McGill University. Today, I'm going to present you the possibility of localized plurilingual approaches in English as a foreign language education at secondary school level in mainland China. So this is part of my MA thesis, and as you can see in this presentation and in my study, I would talk about language education through a plurilingual lens. So here is how I define plurilingualism and relevant terms. So in my presentation and in my study, I see multilingual as the coexistence of different languages in a particular society, while the term plurilingual to refer to individuals' language ability. And I also, besides that, I also use translanguaging in my study as a plurilingual approach, which the overall goal is to build a multilingual classroom in which every student can use their own languages to facilitate their language learning. And then let's move to, here are the contents of my presentation. I would start with my background, and then my study, and the last part will be discussion. So let's start with my background. So this is also the reason why I am doing my MA study. So before I came to Canada to do my master, I have studied English as a foreign language for about like 15 years in a public school system back in China. And in these 15 years, my EFL teachers and my classmates, we all like use Mandarin and the local dialect to help us study English. And when I became an EFL teacher back in China, I also adopted this method. So it's like for me, I thought this is something, taken for granted. But after that, I came to Canada and had this French immersion class organized by the Quebec government, and also communicate with my classmates who is not communicate with my classmates who are not in the same China context like me. I found that it is not the case. So, and besides, I also learned like plurilingualism and plurilingual approaches in Angelica's classes. And that's when I kind of start to thinking about like, have we already used like similar approaches back in China, only not in a naming way? And what are the common grounds between approaches that EFL teachers in China use and plurilingual approaches? And if Chinese EFL teachers are using, some similar approaches, how to, introduce this plurilingual paradigm to them and better localize plurilingual approaches in my context. So this is my background, and which lead me to conduct my study. Here are two research gaps in my study. First is that there is a need to explore more empirical evidence of plurilingual approaches in second language classroom, especially in non-Western contexts. And the second research gap is more related to my background. As I mentioned that I thought that there are some similarities. And although Chinese scholars conducted lots of research about code switching, when I search for relevant references regarding plurilingual practice or approaches in language classroom in China, I could only find a few targeting students and teachers in higher education. Therefore, there is a lack of discussion on the language education in the context of China through the lens of plurilingualism, especially at the secondary school level. And here are my research questions. My research hoped to fill this void by providing valuable insights into how Chinese EFL teachers at secondary school implement and perceive the inclusion of other languages and other cultures. Because teachers in China are unfamiliar with the term plurilingual or plurilingualism, so I asked them like, how do you include other languages, and how do you include Chinese culture instead? So In this presentation, I would provide founding and discussion about the three questions here first: teachers' practice of including other languages and students' home culture. And if you are interested in my founding of the last question here, teachers' perception, you can contact me by email, and I'm happy to share information with you. So here is my research design. I use the mixed method. First, I can kind of have this online interview and got completed answer from 17 participants. And then I had this one-on-one interviews with 4 participants from the same public secondary school. And also, I had this chance to kind of take class observation with 2 interviewees. My initial plan was to have this class observation with 4 interviewees, but lack of funding and I have to be back in Montreal, so I could only do 2. And so here is the findings. As I mentioned, I mainly provide findings for the first 3 questions, and I'm not gonna talk about them in detail due to the time limit. So I just provide you a summary here. In terms of the first 2 questions, to what extent do teachers include Mandarin or other dialects in the classroom, as well as how they allow students to use Mandarin and other Chinese dialects in the classroom? Most participants in the survey and 4 interviewees admitted their practice of using Chinese and at the same time allowing students to use Chinese, Mandarin, and dialect in training students for language skills. And according to the interviewees, all of them, the 4 interviewees, all said that they did it to explain English content or to help students enhance their understanding of the English content. Besides, Huang, who was teaching grade 7 at that time, also said that she would give Chinese instructions. And I also had this chance to pinpoint Shi and Zhong's moment that they kind of switch into Chinese in the real classroom. And here is the result. We can see that although the 2 interviewees claim that they only use Chinese to enhance understanding, they also unconsciously using Chinese for other purpose. And when it comes to the last research question here, to what extent do they include the home culture in the classroom? Surprisingly, all the survey participants acknowledged their reference to Chinese culture. And according to Huang, who was teaching grade 7, and Zhong, who was teaching grade 12 in the interview, they both mentioned that they adopted 2 approaches to integrate Chinese culture. One is to do cultural comparison, and the other is telling Chinese stories in English. And next, let's move to the discussion part. So after analyzing all the data, I found that my participants might be implementing plurilingual approaches, not in a naming way. The use of Chinese language in the EFL classroom in China is not an innovative teaching and learning method, but can sort of date back to the prevalent grammar translation method decades ago in mainland China. And it has been, like I said, it has been discussed by various scholars and teachers under other different framework, for example, first language transfer and code switching. In my study, I try to analyze their first language use from a plurilingual stance. And I think they are using a flexible translanguaging strategy. The main aim of their use of their first language is to kind of scaffold students' English learning, which concurs with other research on translanguaging approaches. Besides translanguaging, Zhong and Shi both mentioned that in the interviews, they adopt translation as a learning and teaching strategy. But their adoption of translation is not the same as the traditional translation method that, consider translation as a straightforward, like one-to-one transference between languages, but a method that helps students to kind of making comparisons and building a relationship between two languages. So here I can provide you an example that Zhong, who was teaching grade 12, provide. So he said that he would ask students to sort of translate conversations which happened in English into Chinese. And he thinks that, to translate the conversation accurately, a student need to completely understand the character's emotion and maybe their status or other context. Their use of translation might be similar to, I'm not sure whether I pronounce this researcher's name right, Gonzalez Davies. This researcher's translation in other learning contexts, pedagogical framework, which kind of consider translation following a social constructivist pedagogical practice as an efficient translanguaging scaffolding strategy. And besides the inclusion of other languages, you can see from the funding that they also including students' home culture. And they mainly took two approaches to this, culture integration. The first being making culture comparison, and the second being the use of the target language to express the national culture. Actually, the latter is more prevalent among teachers. According to Huang and Zhong, the textbook and themselves are gradually pruning the content, introducing Western cultures, and lay more emphasis on promoting domestic cultures. And this kind of telling Chinese story in English method, according to Wang and Li, meets the objectives in two national documents about EFL education in China. So these two national documents specifically stress the importance of English education in assisting students in comparing and evaluating Chinese and foreign culture, identifying with national culture based on an understanding of the cultural differences, and building cultural confidence so that students can actively use English to spread Chinese culture in cross-cultural communication. Besides meeting the objectives in these two documents, these approaches might also meet one of the two objectives of language education from a plurilingual perspective mentioned by Council of Europe. So the first objectives that Council of Europe mentioned is that students could develop communicative competence in which all the languages and cultures that they acquire can play a role. And the second quote I put it here is that through language learning and students can respect the language and culture diversity. To be more specific, when we look into English as a second language or a foreign language, actually EFL teachers in China are facing a similar problem to other colonized or imperialized nations. How to help students access the right form of English while maintaining a critical eye towards the legacy of hegemony in which this profession is embedded. Actually, there is this extensive debate about whether the national education system...
Mind your time.
Okay, sure.
4 minutes.
Okay. The national system, education system should reduce the importance of English. Some scholars and teachers argue that the push of English will endorse Western hegemony or immigration, while the other scholars kind of maintain that students must learn English in order to read Western publications and interact with the world. So we can see that incorporating Chinese culture makes a contribution towards relieving scholars and teachers' concern, because this strategy would help cultivate students' cultural awareness and more importantly, help students to know more about their home culture. So during the interview with one of the participants, he kind of said that his students would learn more Chinese culture in the English class. So these are the contents of my presentation, and here are the conclusion. Now I'm open to question.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.